I'm not gonna lie, lately my mental health ain't been so great. I've been struggling to deal with growing anxiety, seemingly volcanic levels of stress, depression, you name it. It's been tough, but I have observed one thing. I don't think it's any coincidence that in these periods of intense stress or whatever else, I find myself turning to driving games. I'm not a car guy, I can drive, and that's more or less the extent of my knowledge of how cars actually work. For some reason though, I can't get enough of hitting the virtual road when things feel like too much to handle. I think it's to do with the fact that at its core, racing is one of the purest things you can do in a video game. When the world around us can feel so disordered and seemingly impossible to make sense of, there's an escapist joy to be found in just getting from point A to B faster than other people, of losing yourself in the repetition of courses, gradually shaving seconds off of your time with the game providing you an inarguable metric of success. You exist in a vacuum here. In these worlds you disregard all rules and social expectations. Lap times and podium finishes are all that matter. In short, driving games are often a means by which to switch my brain off from the outside world and just focus on finishing first. But lately I've been pouring my time into a couple of driving games that are different. They aren't your Forzas, they aren't your Euro Truck simulators or your Trackmanias. No, these are smaller indie titles. They're rough around the edges than the others, but I found myself getting totally lost in them for reasons completely outside of their intended purpose, directly as a result of their imperfections. These aren't games that allowed me to escape from the anxieties of the outside world, but rather directly reflected those anxieties, and what's more, I found comfort in that. Take Dangerous Driving, for example, which on the surface appears to be the kind of bombastic romp you'd expect from the people who made Burnout, where you travel at ungodly speeds in order to cross the finish line first while causing as much havoc as possible. Taking someone down remains some of the most cathartic fun you will have in a racing game for sure. The simple act of moving through this world so quickly feels incredible. But as I was playing, I began to notice that I was increasingly pulling away from the pack and staying there. Races would start, I'd overtake my rivals, and would continue relatively unbothered for minutes at a time in these surprisingly, often overly long races. The game would inform me in the head-to-head contests that I was a minute or so ahead of my opponent, so beyond the point of warranting any real concern. I found myself cruising leisurely around environments that seemingly ditched the bustling cityscapes I was used to in prior Burnout entries in favour of something more open. The industrial clutter littering the world and the perils that came with navigating it at ludicrous speeds giving way to lush, natural landscapes and open roads that reminded me more of the road trip found in Final Fantasy XV than anything invoking real tension. See, there's a decidedly budget feel to proceedings here, from the lack of a curated soundtrack, the odd technical hitches, to new modes that don't quite nail the landing. You get the feeling the team is working on a shoestring, and features feel a little slapdash. Races should be tighter than this. In a game prioritising wreckage-themed mayhem, there shouldn't be these several minute-long stretches of relative nothing. But I kept finding myself returning. I grew to love this game. Races became less outright competitive and more meditative the more I would predictably surge ahead of the pack. Even with the game's ridiculous rubber banding, I knew I'd be able to get past those opponents with my next boost bar. It wasn't about winning anymore, that was almost a certainty. Rather, I was reflecting on myself, trying to stay focused enough to avoid incoming traffic, in the blur of the world hurtling towards me at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It wasn't unlike the process found in mindfulness, where through things like breathing exercises and meditation, you attempt to become more aware of your physical surroundings, you try to become more present within it all. I learned about it during my time in therapy, and honestly it remains one of the most practically effective means of dealing with spiraling thought patterns I was given. It's not about distracting you or escaping from the real world, quite the opposite. It's about training yourself not to become overwhelmed by how frantic and unpredictable the world can be, to realise that as much as you're not going to change that fact, that's okay, and negative thoughts and feelings will come and go, they don't define you. The world of Dangerous Driving might seem like a near inscrutable blur of oncoming traffic ready to catapult you off the road, but without the need to worry about winning a competition or whatever, by allowing me to just be present on the road for minutes at a time, I was given the chance to make sense of it all in my own head, to break it all down into its component systems and navigate it with relative ease. All of this comes down to the fact that Dangerous Driving doesn't necessarily provide the constant bombardment of explosions and mayhem that it purports to, but as a direct result of that, I was reminded of how powerful a tool mindfulness is in dealing with negative thought patterns. I use this game as a meditation aid, and that is something that only a very specifically imperfect video game could allow for. But if dangerous driving provided me with parallels to real methods of dealing with anxiety, the comfort I found in a game like Snakeybus was more abstract. This is a game I saw marketed as Crazy Taxi meets Snake, and yeah, I guess that's accurate, but what I ended up getting from the game was more akin to Speed as directed by Luis Buñuel. It's a really fun time, but it's not quite as simple as pick up guy, take guy to chicken place, soundtrack by The Offspring. Instead, you pilot this magic growing bus, frantically twisting, turning and rocket jumping through these increasingly surreal environments, crashing through magically reappearing bus stops, hoovering up the otherworldly commuters to take them to their destination without ever stopping, with the only inevitability being that you're going to explode at some point. You start off in a toy model version of Paris with the requisite landmarks all present and accounted for, setting you up for a crazy thrill ride through real-world locations, only for said locations to get more and more abstract as they go on. Paris devolves into nondescript suburb, devolves into grey hellscape literally just called Ring. You go from careening into the Eiffel Tower to smashing into the immovable black orb and falling into the endless void below you. Maybe it's just my daft analytical brain at work here, but as I played, I fell into a pit of questioning this surreal universe that had been created and gradually crumbled as I progressed. It was as funny to me as the gameplay itself. Why are these people waiting to get on a bus to go to the nowhere that's clearly within walking distance? Why is Miami a synthwave album cover that seems to be more light bloom than city? Why are we on a space colony straight out of Gundam? What's the meaning of the orb? Why am I blasting through this world, smashing into everything I see in this haywire tense gameplay for the sake of maintaining these lo-fi hip-hop radio beats to relax/study to? That last point in particular is something I'm kind of fascinated by. The game's aesthetic isn't just wacky, it's oddly relaxing. It's not just weird, it's beautiful in its own way. A level taking place in a museum has no art in it, just a series of conveniently placed winding pathways. That is, however, until you zoom out to examine the carnage you've caused and realise that those pathways merely exist to give a platform to said carnage. The split-second decisions and crazy manoeuvres you're pulling off in order to avoid violent, momentum-halting collisions end up creating these cool-looking arcs and loops and other such unintentional structures. In other words, you're the art. And as I added to my burgeoning screenshot folder, carefully framing shots using the game's flycam to show off the bizarre and at times oddly beautiful results of my gameplay, I realised that this game wasn't just engaging me mechanically or narratively, it was engaging me creatively too. Am I reading into Snakeybus too much? Well, yeah. Those ways in which this world gradually falls apart are just as likely to be the result of the developer losing interest in meticulously crafting real-world places in their daft wee game than it is some statement on the nature of existence. And despite its abstractions, Snakeybus is maybe purer than many out-and-out racing games that, alongside their mechanical simplicity, oftentimes have you living the fantasy of being some kind of rock star or growing your influence in some way. A game like Snakeybus is so distanced from how things work in the real world that you have to look at the broader mechanical strokes in order to make any sense of it. There's no narrative of personal improvement here. You hit start, you keep moving, you grow the numbers, you survive as long as possible. It's pure video game. But I found comfort in examining how these worlds may or may not have been crafted. I'm sorry if this seems a little absurd, but the ways in which I got lost in trying and ultimately failing to disentangle Snakeybus's meaning were oddly reflective of how I've been struggling to make sense of my own life lately. In the last couple of years, I've really struggled with all of this. This job is weird. It's easy in this line of work to become isolated and distanced from the real world when you're pouring so much of yourself into what you do. Despite the common thought that people in this field get paid to play games, I barely play at all, honestly. Most of my life is spent in front of a word processor or an edit suite. The amount of sleep I've lost and meals I've skipped to write and rewrite again, slaving over every sentence and then scrapping everything and starting over because of the fear I'll disappoint my audience, who I have no idea why they care and whose size terrifies me as much as it makes me happy. It's a lot. I've burned out. The pressure to remain on for an audience became too much to handle long ago, if I'm honest. I like writing, but the idea of being a capital P personality is just not who I am. I've learned I don't need or want that validation. But with all of that in mind, I've taken measures to redress the balance a bit, to reconnect with the world around me and realise I'm more than this. I'm not really on social media now because of how much it bums me out. I'm exploring other hobbies, I'm travelling, I've still not quite got the work-life balance thing down, I'll likely be editing this long into the night, but I'm getting there, I'm sleeping more. I'm a completely different person to when I started the channel, but honestly, I feel healthier in a lot of ways since stepping back a bit. But the problem is, in this engagement-driven world, personal growth is different to what that word growth means in relation to this whole thing. Keeping my distance a bit means less engagement, which means the numbers dip, and when that happens, can you really say you're growing? I watch my literal numerical value fluctuate on a day-to-day basis. My ability to eat and pay rent is directly tied to what I love, and what I love is tied to numbers out with my control. I don't mean to downplay how fucking fortunate I am to be able to do this, what I enjoy, what I dreamed of, but I'd be lying, I think anyone would be lying, if it was said that such a dream didn't come with its own nightmarish implications at times. Essentially, life is chaotic right now, for all of us I imagine. It's a maelstrom of contradictory feelings, events, societal pressures, you name it, and it often feels impossible to make sense of. At points, it doesn't feel real, but when I take that step back, when I give myself the time to think about it a little, I realise I'm not defined by that existential chaos. I know in reality that these feelings will pass, I can roll with it, I can keep going to get to the good stuff. And so, what I do is keep moving, I keep growing the numbers, I survive, and at least I'll hopefully have created something worthwhile along the way. Neither Dangerous Driving nor Snakeybus is perfect. They're weird and in some ways borderline broken, but in the same way that Dark Souls encouraged me to push forward in life even when the going got tough, these games, however accidentally, directly reflected my current mental state, allowed me to more directly confront it, and separate from the escapism I find in most other driving games, I got a lot of comfort from that. So I hope you enjoyed that piece reading way too much into a couple of driving games. It feels a little weird to plug the Patreon after all that, but I would like to say a special thank you to Mark B. Writing, Rob, Nico Blakely, Sivas, Artyom Vitsyuk, Hibi Amori, Dallas Keane, William Fielder, my dad, Ali Almuhana, Timothy Jones, Spike Jones, The Nameless Guy, Chris Wright, Ham Megas, Zach Casserly, Samuel Pickens, Shardfire, Anna Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Justin's Holderness, Matthew Natry, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.